Welcome back. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning.
Morning.
Happy whatever day it happens to be.
Yeah, someday. Who knows? But today, we're always excited to talk about ADHD. It's
Yep.
the start of the school year. Here
Right.
in our area, students started back over the last week
Mhm.
or two, depending on whether they're at private school, charter school, or public school. They started within the last couple of weeks.
Right.
I'm sure that wherever anyone is within the next couple of weeks, everybody's going to be back to school, and we're going to start getting all those referrals again for ADHD testing.
Yeah, kids are going to be adjusting to a new school year, and some of them are going to be a little more active or a little less attentive or something. And so this whole issue of ADHD will begin to recur because it's the start of a new school year. We also know that the numbers of children being referred and diagnosed with ADHD continues to rise.
Hmm.
And the same questions and the same reservations keep occurring every year. We have to remember that while we've been studying ADHD for many decades. Um, Parents with young children are just discovering all this for the first time,
Right.
and they're just learning about it for the first time. So we want to keep talking about and updating people on the changes that are about. The other thing I worry about is that many parents continue to say, I absolutely will not put my child on medication. I don't want her to be a zombie. We understand the concern, but that's a discussion that you need to have with a professional,
Right.
because there are children who will benefit from medication. Uh,
Right.
They, they, many children would not be able to go to school or to
Hmm.
benefit from instruction if they're not on medication. It doesn't mean that every child who has these symptoms needs to be on medication,
Right.
but we need to discuss your particular child and what your child needs. So we also want to help you manage the fears and the reservations that you might have about the diagnosis and its treatment.
Right. Because to be honest, if a medication is making your child into like a zombie, it's either the wrong medication, the wrong diagnosis, the wrong dose,
Too
something.
much.
It's not, that's not supposed to happen. But and it's increasingly interesting because throughout my career, and I'm sure that you've experienced the same thing, anytime we talk to somebody who has a child that they think has ADHD,
Right.
we'll talk to them and we'll, an important thing to talk about is family history. And so we'll ask the parent, hey, did you have similar problems when you were a kid? And parents have always, whether it's today or it was 25 years ago, parents always say, oh, well, when I was a kid, nobody really talked about ADHD like that.
It wasn't a
So
thing.
interesting when parents now say that because these are parents who grew up in the 2000s.
Right.
It's like,
That's
yes, you know,
right.
the prevalence rate of ADHD in the 2000s was still about 10% of the population. So, yeah, everybody's talked about ADHD. People
Right.
talked about ADHD since the 50s and
Right.
60s. So,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not like this is a new thing.
Yeah.
They talked about ADHD when I was a kid.
Mhm.
So, if you have a young kid that's in elementary school, they talked about ADHD. ADHD was around when you were a kid as well. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, but it's important to get that family history, um, because there is that heritability associated with it. Um, the big difference is that, or big thing to consider is that when we talk about ADHD, there are three different presentations, and so that variability is significant because we have people with ADHD who are just inattentive. They don't have the bouncing off the walls. They don't have the significant impulsivity necessarily, but they are watching butterflies out the window instead of listening to what the teacher has to say.
They simply can't listen. They can't attend. They just don't do that. Okay.
Right. And
But
that's
they're
a
not.
more common type that we see with girls, historically, but it can happen in boys as well.
Mhm.
Another type is the predominantly hyperactive impulsive type. And these kids, this is a smaller percentage of kids, but these kids are really fascinating because these are the kids that, they almost come across as smart Alex because they're bouncing off the walls, they're impulsive, they're doing all these things, and you say, "What did I just tell you?" And they'll tell
Mm.
you exactly what you just said.
Right.
They hear everything that's going on. They're fully aware of
Very
what's happening, but they just can't sit still.
right. They can't control those impulses.
Right.
Yeah. And then the third, if you put the two together, inattentive and hyperactive, you get what's called the combined presentation.
Mhm.
So, but it's all ADHD. And we understand that many people want to say ADD. And this is just a naming problem from years ago. It's okay to use that. We don't have to argue about it. But there is a single diagnosis, ADHD. It presents in three different ways.
Right.
That's all we're talking about here. But it's important to understand, and I like to review this with parents. What do we mean by inattention? Well, the biggest thing about inattention, and I want to stress this because I think it's really key. Inattention makes it difficult to tolerate tasks that are repetitive or that take a lot of effort.
Right.
It's not just that they're having trouble with attention. They hate repetitive tasks. What is repetitive? Learning your spelling words, learning your sight words, learning the multiplication tables, practicing for anything is repetitive. And
Mhm.
what takes a lot of effort? Writing takes a lot of effort for kids. For kids who are growing up on digital devices, writing something out by hand is a very effortful task.
Right.
Kids with ADHD will either shut down, and their
Mhm.
parents will describe this. He just shuts down, won't do anything. Or they get overwhelmed and they start to act out. They become physically and verbally aggressive and abusive.
Right.
So remember that inattention is about the inability to tolerate tasks that are boring, repetitive, or that take a lot of effort.
Right. And so these are kids where, when you're talking directly to them and you say, "Look me in the eyes while I'm talking to you," they're looking at you and they're still just not focusing on what you're saying. And so they're not paying it full attention. And
Mhm.
if you think about sort of the hierarchy of learning,
Mhm.
attention is the foundation. If you can't pay attention,
Right.
and
Mhm.
that's either you can't pay attention because you don't understand the language, you can't pay attention because you don't understand the material, or you can't pay attention because your brain is just not focusing on what it is that's being presented to you. Whatever the
Right.
case may be, if you can't pay attention to something, you can't learn it.
Right.
You
Exactly.
can.
Right.
So inattention is more than just thinking about, oh, she's forgetful.
Right.
It's more than just that.
Right. Yeah. If you want to remember something, you first of all have to attend to it.
Right.
In the information processing model, attention precedes memory. If you're not attending, you're not going to remember. And
Right.
what is school? Remembering.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Impulsivity, as the name suggests, these children are less able to regulate their emotions and their actions. They just don't have complete control of their actions, but they all, and we know about that because we know about hyperactivity. They don't control their actions, but they also don't control their emotions. And this is a larger problem, or equally important problem, is they don't control their emotions and they act before they think.
Right.
And when we say that, that's a simple thing to say. But you're asking them to think first, and they're not going to. They
Right.
are going, by definition, they will act before they think.
It makes me insane when people say you have a kid who's super impulsive and they
Right.
say, okay, our intervention is you need to stop and think before you act. Well, no kidding. It's like, but if they could do that, they probably would. And if we tie some of these things together, and I don't know that people necessarily think about it this way, but we were just talking about inattention. Um, Inattention can be, in some ways, differentiated from distractibility
Right.
by
Yeah.
impulsivity. You're distracted because your attention is impulsively pulled away to something else.
Mhm.
Um, Kids who that just purely inattentive, they can be looking at you the entire time
Right.
and just not attending to you. The
Right.
kid that's distractible, when you're talking to them, their eyes are going off and they're like looking away. They're not
Right.
necessarily bouncing off the walls or anything like that, but their eyes are darting and they're not really paying attention to detail, so they make careless mistakes with things. Um, you know, Now there is the impulsivity that leads to the behavior things. I had a
Right.
kid in here the other day who was literally bouncing on the couch the entire time we're talking. Now, he maintained a good conversation with me. He stayed on topic. We talked about several things that was going on in his life, but he was bouncing in the on the couch the entire time,
Right. Yep.
you know? So he was attentive, but
Right.
he was impulsive and he was hyperactive.
Bernie, I know this has happened to you. You can be doing an assessment with a child, and it's a timed test, and they know it's timed, and they know they're under some time pressure. And you can watch them taking the test, and as they're taking it, they're looking around. Their eyes are moving all over the desk. They're looking at things in the office. They're supposed to be working, and they might be, but they're looking around the whole time. That's what we mean by impulse control. They can't stop doing what they want to do,
Right.
right? And it's not that they're being disrespectful. It's not that they're being disobedient. This is just what they do. If you have ADHD, this is the stuff that you do.
Right.
Now, the other thing we want to mention with these characteristics is, and this is very important when it comes to how we're going to treat children with ADHD, children with ADHD have conflicts with the adults in their lives.
Hmm.
About 40% of children and teens with ADHD also have oppositional defiant disorder. Those
Hmm.
two things come together in about 40% of kids. But about 80% of children encounter some kind of conflict with teachers and parents. So most children with ADHD are going to encounter conflicts with parents and teachers,
Right.
right?
And we've talked many times about some of our concerns about the diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder. And you know, we have certainly met kids who meet criteria for oppositional defiant disorder. But a lot of that has to do with our interpretation of the child's behavior. Is the child inattentive and not focusing and becomes distracted, and that's why they're not following directions? Or are they willfully disobedient, and that's why they're not following directions? Um, the same behavior, they're not following directions, but depending on the parents or the teacher's perspective of why the child's not behaving and
Right.
not being compliant, could lead to one diagnosis or the other.
That's
But,
right.
but all of that is outside of the idea that 80% of these kids have some kind of conflict with the important adults in their life.
And that's going to become important when we start to talk about interventions. You're
Right.
going to have this, kids with ADHD have a very difficult relationship with parents and teachers
Hmm.
because of their behavior. So why do they act the way they do? And this is important. I was meeting with a parent the other day. She was so relieved to hear this because she said, yes, that's what I'm experiencing. Number one, kids with ADHD are attracted to exciting things. The more
Right.
excitement, the more they're attracted to it.
Yeah.
And sometimes those are bad things, but they're still fireworks are exciting,
Mhm.
fast cars are exciting.
Right.
Second, they can't stay in their seat. They just move around a lot. Testing a girl the other day, and within 2 or 3 minutes, she was standing up to take the test.
Hmm.
She functions better when she's standing and moving. They talk too much, and they talk too much at the wrong times. They want to explore. They want to see what's going on. How many times have you said you're writing a test report and you write the child was exploring the office. They come around and they touch things. They just are interested and they're always exploring. And they also want to try and see what happens, how things work.
Hmm.
What happened? What will happen if I do this?
Right.
And they pull fire alarms because they're just curious and they want to know what happens. So
Right.
they're doing these things not because it's not misbehavior. They're doing these things because they are curious and interested and impulsive.
Right. There's no real, for the most part, there's no real ill intent. They're not trying to be jerks
Mm.
necessarily. It is, genuine curiosity. It is genuine, impulsive
Right,
behavior. It is genuine, just interest in what's going on around them. And it's hard for them because of the way that their brain functions. It's hard for them to filter out those distractions and say, that's not important right now. What's important right now is this
right,
wonderful lecture that I'm hearing right now about, whatever it is that the teacher is talking about.
Right. Once
The
again,
sounds over there are much more interesting, but I'm going to ignore that because I'm supposed to be doing it. That's really hard for a kid with ADHD.
that's right. Kids with ADHD, they just have to do, they have to say, and they have to go. Please understand that. However, all this activity, all this impulsivity, all this movement, all this talking leads to negative interactions with adults. These kids are always, and these kids are always getting yelled at. They're always getting punished. They're always made to feel bad.
Hmm.
And some kids, when kids get into this difficult relationship with all the adults in their lives, parents, teachers, grandparents, coaches, everybody's pounding on them all the time with the same message. Some kids will take all that negative information and start to say, there's something wrong with me. I'm damaged. I'm bad, or I'm stupid, or I'm something. And they'll internalize it and they'll begin to develop a negative self-image.
Right,
Other kids will revolt and become aggressive.
right.
Okay. So it's that pounding that they're getting from everybody, that's that same message. Pay attention, stop moving, stop doing this. And some kids will withdraw and 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 have a poor self-image, and other kids are going to fight back.
Yeah, I mean, imagine what it would be like to hear "you're making me crazy" all the time. If a kid hears that from their parents all the time for reasons that they can't control, and that's probably the key piece is that the kid knows that they can't control it. And
Right.
so me as a person, who I am as a person, is making this person, my parent, crazy and
Mhm.
making them yell at me and leading to them punishing me. That can take a big shot to their self-image and the perception of themselves.
Right.
So we have to be mindful of the things that they're good at and the things that they struggle with.
Right. Yeah, they're not good please remember, these kids are not good at repetitive, boring, and tasks that take a lot of effort.
Right,
And a lot of schoolwork falls into that category.
right,
Keep that in mind. When you ask them, number two, when you ask them to stop doing something that they find interesting, to do something that's what's interesting. Video games are interesting.
sure,
Programs are interesting. Playing games with their brothers and sisters. That's all interesting stuff. Running around the house chasing a sibling is much more interesting. So when you tell them to stop doing what they find interesting, to do something that is boring, repetitive, or takes a lot of effort, you're going to get some resistance. You're,
right,
you're asking them to trade this for this. Not a good trade in their eyes, and you're going to get a little resistance. And that resistance, because they have no impulse control, they can escalate in a hurry.
right,
And for some kids, it's going to be a temper tantrum. For other kids, it's going to be a verbal argument. When you get to the teenage years, you're going to get open rebellion. Okay,
yeah,
they're going to respond to these requests to stop doing something they want to do something that they find anathema, that's just the complete opposite of who they are.
right.
Okay.
So,
So what do you do if your kid
right.
has ADHD or ODD or anything like this? Okay.
Yeah. Well, and I think the first thing we should talk about is what not to do. Um, the first thing is, you know, I mean, I don't know how many times we've told this to encourage parents to do this, but to just stop the lectures. Stop doing repeating the same thing over and over and over again. If you're yelling at them about the same thing, if you're yelling at them about the same thing every day, clearly they're not getting the message. So we need to do something different. If you can see it in the child's face when they're sitting in a session and their parents are in here with them, and the parent starts on their lecture. I have to tell him every day, da 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 da. You can see the child's brain just turn off
Right. Right.
because if they're not good at repetitive, boring, those types of things, I'm sorry to say this, parents, your lectures are boring, repetitive, and not going to be attended to.
There's a concept in psychology called habituation.
Right.
And if you put your watch on or a bracelet, when you first put it on, you feel it.
Right.
You're aware of it. But in the course of the day, you forget that it's there because those neurons that are feeling that, they just settle down and they habituate and they get used to it and say everything's okay. What these kids do, because they're constantly being yelled at, they're constantly getting these lectures, they habituate and they'll
And-
listen, they'll sit still for your lecture, but it's not going to matter to them because it's happened too much. And the same thing happens with punishment.
Right.
These kids are in a constant state of punishment. They're always being punished. They're always being lectured. And after a while, it stops mattering. We say punishment doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is because these kids are punished so much and so often that they just don't care anymore.
Right. Yeah. I was talking to a kid the other day, and he's just entering into the teenage years, but he was talking about how he would be punished growing up. And, he said he got to the point where he would rather get a spanking than get a lecture because the lectures were so boring, and at least the spankings were ever quick. And he
Right.
said that it even got to the point where the spankings, he had to pretend like he was hurting from the
Yeah,
spankings just so that they would end because those didn't matter anymore either.
that's right.
And so it's
They're in a constant state of punishment. And it just, how many times have you heard a kid say, they can take everything they want out of my room. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to change. I mean, they can take everything but the mattress out. Not going to matter.
right.
What does work?
Yeah.
Several things that we've talked about many times. Structure. They have to have a structured schedule.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the we've done a podcast in the past, and you can do a search on our page about the 168-hour rule. There's 168 hours in a week, and you can there's a simple process that you can go through and just say, okay, this is how much time in the week that you have for these different things. And we can create a routine and a structure and a schedule so that we can get done everything that needs to be done, but also you have the time for your free time and the time that you want to, play games and relax and those kind of things. But it's the structure that's so important.
Mhm.
When you come home from school, this is what you do, and you do that every day.
Right.
Parents who, pick their kids up from school and then some days they go home, some days they go to the store, sometimes they go to the library, sometimes they go to a friend's house. When it's inconsistent like that, the kid doesn't have a routine. We talked about this in the last podcast for babies. When they don't have a consistent routine, they don't know what to expect. And so their brain and their body doesn't get into a rhythm for how to manage these things.
Yeah. If you're going to go to the library, go the same day. Say, oh, honey, it's Wednesday. And every Wednesday we go to the library. You start to get into a schedule. We start to get into a routine. Okay.
Mhm.
So number one is structure. Number two, prevention. Prevent problems from occurring in the first place. If you have a child with ADHD, don't stop at the grocery store on the way home from school. They're already wired from school. They want to get home. They're going to be excited. They go into a grocery store, you're going to have a problem.
Right.
Okay. So think about what you're doing. Think about where you're going. Think about this from the child's perspective.
Mhm.
What do you have to do to prevent problems? Also, when you do give instructions, keep them simple and put them up somewhere so the kid can see them. I
Right.
mean, don't ask your child, don't give multiple commands. Just do one thing at a time because that's probably all they can handle. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And so many times parents will say, okay, I want you to do this, 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 give them three or four or five things to do. And then they get mad when they don't do more than the second or third one.
Yeah, they get it wrong. Mhm.
Recognize what's happening, parents. Recognize that maybe giving them that many things to do at one time is too much. Well, they should be able to do it. Okay, we can talk about the word should, but they don't and they can't.
They
So
can't.
don't
Yeah.
do it. It's boggling, it's mind-boggling why we expect them to do something that they clearly can't do, and then we get mad at them for not doing it.
But and I wish that's the main message that I would like to get across is you're asking them to do something that they cannot do because of the diagnosis.
Right.
And then you get angry that they're not doing it.
Right.
Stop and think. They're not going to stop and think. Their brains will not
Yeah.
allow them to
Yeah,
do
yeah,
that.
the most ridiculous example that we always give, but is still true, whether people like it or not, is if your child needs glasses, you're not going to punish them for not seeing because they don't have their glasses on.
Right. Yeah, you wouldn't think of
Need
it.
glasses, so you can't expect them to see without their glasses.
Right.
And this is the same thing with ADHD. They can't do some of these things. And we're not trying to use it as an excuse. They're still,
Right.
a lot of times kids with glasses still won't. do some of the things that you want them to do that are vision based. Even a kid with ADHD, if they're on their medication and everything, they still have to willfully make the decision to do things. That's a completely different
Right.
subject.
Mhm.
But when they're not treated, when when they're clearly struggling with these things over and over and over again, parents recognize that, maybe changing some of those expectations, not
Right.
lowering expectations, just changing the way that you're expecting it, sometimes that can make the world of a difference.
Right. So two more points. Well, two under this one. We want to teach, focus on, and reward acceptable behaviors. Russ Barkley, a famous ADHD scholar, talked about the 4-to-1 rule, that if every time you say something negative to your child,
Mhm.
you should say four positive things. And we could talk about this for a long time. But what that is his shorthand of saying, focus on the positives. The
Right.
negatives are always there, but try to give them more positive messages than negative messages. And then the last thing is if you have to, when you do have consequences, and we believe in consequences, but we believe that consequences should teach something and not just punish children.
Right.
The goal is not to punish. The goal is to teach. Teach them how to do things. If they can, they will. And you have to teach
Absolutely.
them. Okay.
Absolutely. So now a little bit about emotions.
We forget about emotions with these kids, and don't forget about their emotional life. And
Right.
and sometimes we do.
Right, because they can be impulsively emotional. Kids with ADHD, oftentimes when something doesn't hit them right, they will have this burst of emotion. Now, it's
Right.
usually short-lived. It's not like it's something that typically lasts all day long,
Right.
but they can have very strong, heightened emotions, sort of impulsively. And so w- when these kids are in those, when you have a kid with ADHD and they have some of these emotional outbursts, it's the same type of thing. You have to recognize that some of it is outside of their control. They can't just turn it off. They can't just not respond. They're going to get mad when something like that happens because that impulse is going to hit them and they're going to react that way.
Right. We often think about their impulsivity in terms of their behavior,
Mhm.
their act.
Yeah. Oh, your video froze.
They have the same impulsivity when it comes to their emotions.
Right. Yeah, your video paused there for a second, but
Yeah,
you were saying that the idea that just like their emotions or their behaviors can be impulsive, their emotions can be impulsive too. They come out and they present, and they can't necessarily stop and think ahead of time.
mhm.
They can't do that. And none of this is an excuse. We're not talking about that we should use, well, he can't help it. He has ADHD, and so we just allow it to continue to happen. We have to teach skills, but that's what you said just a moment ago. Consequences are intended to teach, not punish. So we need to teach skills to be able to manage that stuff instead of just punishing for not doing it.
Right. And we also know that they're not big on delayed gratification. Okay. They don't like to wait in line. They don't like to wait their turn. Whether they're talking or moving or playing, they want everything to happen their way. They don't want to wait for anybody else. They don't want to wait for people to talk. They don't want to wait in line. So remember that. Don't, and when we talk about prevention, remember that these kids aren't big on delayed gratification. So try not to put them into situations. However, they need to learn how to do that. So this is a skill that you need to teach, but don't have the expectation that they have that ability. You're going to have to teach
Absolutely.
them.
And the last thing that we'll talk about before we wrap up today is the idea of social interactions and friends. Um, Kids with ADHD tend to be very social, especially the hyperactive impulsive type. They tend to be very social. They, jump into relationships. They when they get to the playground, they are immediately going to other kids to try to say, hey, you want to play? You want to be friends? You want to do this? You want to do that? Um, but at the same time, they will have difficulty following conversations. They will have a hard time. Um, Managing things because they want to do what they want to do. And so that impulsivity is there. And so they have a hard time maybe taking following another kid, they want to be in charge. They want to, this is what we should do. And they're impatient and they just want to do. And, especially if the kid that they're trying to play with doesn't have ADHD and doesn't have some of those same characteristics, they'll bulldozer them. They'll just bowl right over them.
Yeah,
Uh,
they overwhelm them with
yeah.
language and behavior and just they're constantly on, and it overwhelms the other children. Okay.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so they tend to get ostracized because they're just too much. I mean, they're too much for even kids the same age. Okay.
Right.
The other thing is they have to be the center of it all. They want things to be the way they want them to be because they want it at their tempo and according to their rules. So they sort of put themselves in that position and they get angry quickly. If things don't work the way they want, or somebody is getting in the way, or somebody is doing things differently, they have no patience for that and they get angry. The other thing that you'll notice with children with ADHD is that they don't get invited back
Right.
to people's homes because they're just too much. They're too active. There's too much energy. And frequently they don't get invited to parties. They don't get invited for sleepovers. They don't get invited to join their friends in their homes. And so you need to be aware of that. And again, frequently we forget about the emotional development of children with ADHD and the social development of children with ADHD. And we need to keep those in the equation somewhere.
Absolutely. And that's probably the one of the most heartbreaking things when you work with these kids is that when they start to have some of that emotional and social consequences of their symptoms, and you see them struggle so much in trying to form and maintain relationships. And so, but again, it takes a lot of work and teaching them skills and teaching them how to handle and manage those situations so that they can get better at it. Um, so again, as we're getting started in the school year, we're just encouraging parents and teachers and everyone, anyone working with kids, about 10-15% or so of kids that you see are going to have ADHD or at least some of the symptoms. And so, they're going to struggle with some of these things. And our goal is to, recognize that and work with them to try to overcome some of those difficulties so that it doesn't create as many problems as it potentially could.
And if you're concerned that your child might have ADHD and you're not sure or you're afraid of medication or interventions, talk to a professional, come in, talk to us.
Hmm.
We can go through it with, again, no obligation. We're not going to rush into medication, but you need to understand what life is like from the child's perspective because it's a difficult existence.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that is it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.